What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be ranking the albums of the American death metal legends, Obituary. Obituary have always been a pretty interesting death metal band to me. I would say most of their stuff is not critically acclaimed, yet at the same time, they've been extremely consistent and extremely prolific, and also very influential and popular amongst both death metal fans and hardcore fans. For some quick background on the group, they formed way back in 1984 under the name Executioner. They would soon solidify their core lineup, which consisted of John Tardy on vocals, his brother Donald Tardy on drums, Trevor Perez on rhythm guitar, and Alan West on lead guitar. With this lineup, they would sign to Roadrunner Records, change their name to Obituary in 1988, and release their 1989 debut, Slowly We Rot. Compared to Obituary's other albums, I would say Slowly We Rot sounds the most like traditional Florida death metal, especially with that classic Scott Burns production job that it has. I definitely get reminded of Def's Leprosy album listening to this, but I still think there was a lot on this album that set Obituary apart. One, unlike other death metal albums from the late 80s, there's really not much of a thrash influence on here. In fact, a lot of these songs feature kind of dirgy riffs that almost sound like what Celtic Frost would be playing if they played death metal. Also, while this album is built from a lot of really chunky and primitive riffs, the songs themselves aren't very simple. In fact, they're not really that formulaic at all, and it makes for a pretty interesting listen. The final thing I would say set Obituary apart are John Tardy's vocals, which I would say are pretty much iconic at this point. He is easily one of the best death metal vocalists of all time, with so much projection and power in his voice and just these garbled, demented rasps that he's used throughout the band's career and that first appeared on this album. Like most of Obituary's early albums, this one's famous for not actually having lyrics. In fact, John has said some of what's come out of his mouth weren't even words. That being said, I think all those core elements really combine to make a strong album here. I wouldn't necessarily say there's a lot of standout tracks here, but I do love just how much meat is on these riffs and how much you get a good mix of faster and slower tempos on this album. There definitely are some cool notable cuts, however. The title track, for example, is one of the band's best songs. I love that atmospheric opening before it just breaks into this really catchy barrage. Gates to Hell is probably one of the most thrashy tracks here, and John just sounds absolutely demonic on it. In terms of other notable songs, I would say Immortal Visions, Suffocation, and Intoxicated are all pretty cool. But really, I'd say there's nothing bad here. With a few more standout moments, I think it probably could have been better, but there's a reason this is regarded as one of Obituary's best. This, to me, belongs right at the top on S tier. Alright, so following Slowly We Rot to Obituary, we welcome famous lead guitarist James Murphy to the band, who would replace the band's former lead guitarist Alan West. James Murphy is famous for his work on Death's Spiritual Healing, as well as his own band Disincarnate, along with a whole bunch of other work he's done. Longtime bassist Frank Watkins would also join after Slowly We Rot, and Frank would replace the original bassist Daniel Tucker. And with this lineup, the band would release their second album, 1990's Cause of Death. Compared to the debut, I would say Cause of Death definitely feels much more mature. The songs here are longer than the debut, with a lot of different movements and some surprisingly unconventional songwriting. A lot of these songs, for example, have actually pretty sparse use of vocals. The opening track, Infected, has an extended instrumental opening where James kind of shows off his lead guitar chops. But then you have songs like Dying, which is around 5 minutes long and is almost entirely instrumental for its entire runtime. Even some of the hits on this album, like Find the Arise, actually have pretty sparse use of vocals. I think that trait kind of sets this album apart from other old school death metal albums, and it also makes Cause of Death kind of feel surprisingly atmospheric, which again I think sets it apart from other death metal albums that were coming out around this time. The other thing I'll say about Slowly We Rot is it feels like the compositions are really interesting. They're both adventurous and immediately accessible at the same time. I think Chopped in Half is a good example of that, with its iconic stop-start rhythm opening at the beginning, but then it develops through a lot of other movements as well and really doesn't rely on that one idea to carry the song. The title track also has a lot of cool ideas going on, but the real standout moment of that is that catchy, bouncy riff that comes with the shouts of the track title. Turned Inside Out is another neat track with a bit of hardcore swagger to it, kind of similar to what would show up on some of the band's albums in the later 90s. John, once again, sounds fantastic on this album. I love Find the Arise, where he just sounds absolutely psychotic. Memories Remain also stands out with its iconic Life Goes On vocal hook. I think overall, Cause of Death is just the most developed, most interesting, and most mature Obituary album. I've heard people say this record is unfocused, and I can understand that criticism, but I definitely don't agree with it. I think Cause of Death is a classic for a reason, and to me, this is even better than Slowly We Rot. This goes right to the S tier and right to the top of that tier. Alright, so following Cause of Death, lead guitarist James Murphy would leave the band, and Alan West would rejoin for the band's third album, The End Complete, in 1992. I think The End Complete is kind of the blueprint for a lot of Obituary's subsequent albums that would come out in the 90s. It's really here where they would start becoming a lot more accessible, and John would really start using his vocals a lot more to fill out these tracks. This is also really where the band's kind of more groovy and hardcore flirtations would really start to emerge. The opening track, I'm in Pain, really shows that with these groovy, bobbing riffs, which does a pretty good job combining those ideas with tremolos to make for a really strong opener. In fact, I would say one thing this album does well is that while a lot of these songs have those big, meaty, slow riffs, a lot of them also effectively use tremolo, which I think is important in adding some character to these tracks. Dead Silence, I think, is a good example of that, with kind of this reflective tremolo line that comes in between these bigger riffs. I would say The End Complete also has some pretty cool flow to it. Corrosive is kind of an instrumental breather that comes later in the track list. And then the most popular song of this album, which is the title track, comes almost at the end. This is a pretty interesting song. It's really heavy, yet it just kind of glides along with this sense of confidence. I also really like those stop-start rhythms that appear near the end of this song. In terms of other things I like about The End Complete, I love the revving chainsaw guitars of the production. The performances here, I would say, sound maybe a little bit tighter than the prior two albums. And while there's a lot of slower, sludgier moments here, I think there's also a lot of faster tempos too to add some variety, like on songs like Back to One and Sickness, both of which are pretty fun. There definitely are a few dull moments on The Incomplete, but I think overall it's a pretty strong album. I'll put it on the A tier for now, but we'll see how that ends up. Alright, so following The Incomplete, Obituary would return for their fourth album in 1994 with World Demise. World Demise definitely continues that evolution from The End Complete. Again, a lot more vocals on this album, not a whole lot of blank space, and it feels a little bit more immediately accessible. The hardcore influences are really coming to the forefront on World Demise, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The opening track, Don't Care, for example, is a pretty menacing way to kick this record off. I also like Solid State and Boiling Point, which almost sound like stompy, aggressive hardcore that you would hear from like Madball or other bands of that ilk. The one thing I will say about World Demise is there's a lot more slower, crunchier kind of mosh riffs here, and fewer tremolo riffs, and also fewer traditional death metal riffs in general, which I think makes for a slightly less interesting album than the prior albums. I do think the band are pretty good at playing these groovy riffs, and they are kind of fun, but I think the big knock against this album is just that it's really long. At over 50 minutes, this is one of the band's longest records, and considering how similar a lot of the tracks are on World Demise, I really don't think it needed to be 50 minutes long. That said, there definitely were some cool developments on this album. In keeping with the cover art, this has kind of a dingier, more industrial feel, which is furthered by the industrial effects on songs like the title track and Splattered. Kill For Me also has some kind of tribal-sounding drums at the start, which are pretty neat. Final Thoughts is definitely a good song as well, which has these kind of whispers and then these ominous pounding rhythms. This is actually still incorporated in the band's set list today, which is pretty cool. The solos on this album are also pretty good. It's certainly not a bad album, but I would say not one of their stronger efforts. I'll throw it at B tier, but we'll see how that shakes out. Alright, so following World Demise, Obituary would return in 1997 with their fifth album, Back from the Dead. The title of this album is kind of a misnomer because it wasn't really a comeback album. There was a 3-year gap, but there was no hiatus during that time. Stylistically, this really isn't that different from World Demise. The groovy and more hardcore sound is still very much at the forefront here. There are definitely some differences between this album and the last album, however. This one is quite a bit shorter. It has this revving chainsaw guitar tone to it that is pretty cool, but also kind of feels like it dominates the mix a little bit. The vocals here are also really clear and almost sound more like a hoarse shout as opposed to a proper death growl, and I would say might be my least favorite John Tardy performance. The other thing I'll say about Back from the Dead and the prior two albums is that they felt kind of more accessible than maybe the first two albums, but they also felt like they had less depth, and they weren't quite catchy enough to make up for that lack of depth. As another knock against Back from the Dead, I'd also say the back half of this album is pretty homogenous. The closing track, Obituary, is just bizarre and kind of combines rapping with death metal. It's actually not terrible, but it's just kind of strange and not really what I want to hear on an Obituary album. There is some good stuff here, though. The opening track, Threatening Skies, is a pretty cool song, and again, still something they play live. Lockdown, I would say, features that hardcore influence arguably at its peak, and honestly is a pretty neat track. Back from the Dead is definitely one of Obituary's less highly regarded albums, but honestly, it's really not that bad. I've heard much worse albums from legacy death metal bands. I'll put it in D tier because I really don't think there's much in their catalog that's worse, but again, it really isn't a bad album. I think it's just beaten out by everything else they've done. So following Back from the Dead, Obituary would take an extended break. I don't think they ever actually officially went on hiatus, but from what I understand, they stopped playing live and stopped recording, but would eventually return in 2005 with their sixth album, Frozen in Time. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because normally when a band takes a lot of time off, you expect the band to come back with a lot of ideas and inspiration. But here, it kind of feels like Obituary had a good idea of what direction they wanted to go in, but didn't really have the material to support that stylistic decision. And what I mean by that is it feels like stylistically, the band kind of stripped away some of those more hardcore and groove influences that were creeping in on their 90s albums and went back to more of the straight death metal sound of Slowly We Rot and Cause of Death. While I think that was a good approach, the problem with Frozen in Time for me is that the riffing here just feels pretty simple and forgettable. Obituary have always had pretty simple riffs, granted, but here just a lot of them feel pretty nondescript and kind of boring. Honestly, listening to this, I kind of miss the groovy flirtations of those 90 albums because at least they were kind of fun to listen to. It's definitely not all bad though. Frozen in Time has a great opening track with Redneck Stomp, which is about a 3-minute instrumental that just oozes confidence with these really groovy riffs. Insane is a nice song with a pretty quick groove going on. I also like On the Floor with its shouts of the track title. The solos here are good. The guitars have a lot of crunch to them, which is pretty cool. In fact, I think this would be the last album Scott Burns would ever produce before retiring. I would also say compared to Back from the Dead, Frozen in Time is a little more varied. It's got a good mix of faster tempos and slower tempos. But that said, Frozen in Time is definitely one of their weaker efforts overall. I'll put it on D tier next to Back from the Dead and just slightly higher than that album. Alright, so following Frozen in Time, Alan West would leave the band, leading to the famous Ralph Santola to join the group on lead guitar. Ralph is probably most famous for the work he did in Deicide. The band would also leave Roadrunner Records following Frozen in Time and sign to Candlelight Records for their follow-up album, 2007's Executioner's Return. I admit I did not have the highest hopes going into this album, especially given the fact that the cover artwork kind of looks like a mediocre PlayStation 2 game from 2001. But that being said, I was definitely pleasantly surprised by this one. Stylistically, this definitely reminds me a lot more of Frozen in Time in that it leans more towards the death metal side and kind of leaves out those more groovy and hardcore flirtations from the 90s. But I think this just does it a lot better than Frozen in Time, mainly because Executioner's Return just sounds a lot more inspired to me. Evil Ways, for example, has these super nice grooves that almost remind me of Bolt Thrower, and the way the vocals just match up with the grooves is fantastic. I also love Seal Your Fate, which is just a banging thrasher. I love the variety you get on Executioner's Return, and while you also had some good variety on Frozen in Time, I think the songs are just better on Executioner's Return. Lasting Presence and the opening track Face Your God, for example, have this really fast Hellhammer style feel to it. I think this record, more so than Frozen in Time, sounds like it should have been the band's comeback album because this record just sounds so reinvigorated to me. I will say the one downside to Executioner's Return is that the second half does feel like a bit of a slog. There's a long doomy song, Contrast the Dead, which is about 7 minutes long. There's also a lot of other slower songs in the second half that make it a little less interesting than the first half to me. That said though, at 40 minutes, this album isn't terribly long, and the Santola solos combined with those meaty riffs really do wonders here. Surprisingly, this is the lowest rated Obituary album on Metal Storm, which I found pretty interesting because I actually think it's really good. It's certainly more inspired than Frozen in Time, and I'd actually put it just slightly higher than The Incomplete. I think it's a really good album. Alright, so following Executioner's Return, Obituary would return in 2009 with Darkest Day. Darkest Day still continues that sound from the last album, leaning more towards death metal as opposed to the groovy, hardcore sounds of the 90s albums. But I'd say overall, Darkest Day is a little bit of a step down compared to Executioner's Return. One of the reasons why is it feels like there's a little less variety here. List of Dead continues that trend of fast, pummeling openers, and it also has some great grooves to it. But after that song, you really just kind of have one mid-tempo track after another. These mid-tempo songs aren't necessarily bad. Blood to Give, for example, is kind of neat with an almost southern metal style feel to it. But a lot of these songs just feel really similar to each other, and a lot of them also feel really repetitive, particularly Lost Inside and Payback, which kind of just go on a little too long. Truth Be Told is another song I think that should have just been left out. It also doesn't help that Darkest Day is 53 minutes long, which I think is the longest Obituary album. That being said, though, this definitely isn't their weakest album. I think a lot of these riffs actually sound surprisingly fresh. There are some pretty cool moments here, too, like on Fields of Pain, which has this kind of thrumming riff that I really like. Violent Dreams is a nice short pummeling thrasher. Forces Realigned is a late album highlight that I really enjoy. I really like the way the vocal lines kind of mimic the tremolo lines in this song. Left to Die is a nice, slow, menacing closer, and while I definitely enjoy it, it kind of does drag a little bit. I think that sort of captures my feelings toward Darkest Day as a whole, is that it's kind of a mixed bag for me. Pretty much on par with World Demise, I would say, but I would put Darkest Day a little bit higher, again, because it's got a little more variety than World Demise does, but still not one of their stronger efforts. Alright, so following Darkest Day, Ralph Santolo would leave the band and Kenny Andrews would take over on lead guitar. Ralph would unfortunately later pass away in 2018, rest in peace. As another lineup change, bassist Frank Watkins would also separate from Obituary following Darkest Day, and he would be replaced by the infamous Terry Butler, who's done work in Massacre, Death, along with, most recently, Inhuman Condition. Sadly, Frank Watkins would also pass away in 2015, rest in peace to him. With Kenny and Terry on board, however, the band would sign to Relapse Records and release their ninth album, Inked in Blood, in 2014. Inked in Blood kind of has that feeling of a comeback album, given there was a 5-year gap between this and Darkest Day and a new label. And again, you would kind of think a comeback album would be pretty strong, but here, yeah, not so much. I think the biggest issue with Inked in Blood to me is that it just doesn't feel super inspired. A lot of the songs, particularly in the second half, just kind of ride rote riffage and just sort of feel dull, especially the track Within a Dying Breed. Again, with Inked in Blood, I would say a lot of these songs are pretty repetitive as well, which again has been a problem in the past, but just feels particularly annoying here given some of the other issues on this album. I would say this issue of repetition even applies to some of the stronger tracks here, like Visions in My Head, which has a great pounding stop-start rhythm, but I kind of just wish was 30 seconds to a minute shorter. Another interesting thing about Inked in Blood is I would say the hardcore flirtations of the 90s kind of start re-emerging here, particularly on songs like Pain Inside and Out of Blood. I don't think that was necessarily a bad choice, but honestly, compared to how they were done in the 90s, they just feel a little less inspired here. Inked in Blood definitely has its positives, however. I like the opening track Centuries of Lies, which has a really fast pace, these cool chords during the chorus, and nice chugs to it as well. Violent by Nature has some big lurching grooves and a cool outro. Minds of the World is another catchy song that I really like. But yeah, I would say overall Inked in Blood is a pretty weak effort. I actually prefer World Demise to Inked in Blood, just because for all of World Demise's flaws, that at least sounded more inspired than Inked in Blood did. I'll put Inked in Blood at C tier. Alright, so following Inked in Blood, Obituary would return in 2017 with their self-titled effort. Stylistically, the band's self-titled album definitely fits in nicely with the band's later albums. There's a decent amount of variety with some faster tempos, some sludgier tempos, some slower tempos. I think the biggest difference between this and Inked in Blood, however, is that this album just sounds really reinvigorated. The record starts with a trademark fast opener, Brave, but rather than going into a mid-tempo song as the second track, we actually get another fast song with Sentence Day, which has some cool melodic riffs in its second half, along with some great solos. Then you have the song A Lesson in Vengeance, which has this really memorable vocal line of, "Just give me something." End It Now has some really hungry riffing, while Kneel Before Me has some really cool tremolos. In addition to the more inspired songs, I think the drumming here is really great. The rhythms just hit really hard and feel, again, just really inspired. I haven't talked much about Donald Tardy's drumming in this ranking list, but I do think that deserves a special mention because he has so much power to his performance and such a sense of groove and liveliness, and doesn't feel mechanical at all, which is not something I can say about a lot of other death metal drummers. While he pretty much shines on every Obituary album, I think his performance here is definitely notable in my book. I think the biggest downside with the self-titled album is there's still a lot of mid-tempo stuff going on, which kind of makes things feel pretty homogenous, especially in the second half. I also wish the song No Hope wasn't considered a bonus track because I actually think it's one of the best songs here. That said, at a little bit over 30 minutes, this album definitely doesn't overstay its welcome, and I would say the self-titled record is definitely a really enjoyable album overall. It's really close to the end complete to me, but not quite as good. I'll put it on B tier, and in the interest of keeping things separated, I'll put World Demise down on C tier, which I think is fair. Alright, so following the self-titled album, Obituary would experience some delays due to COVID, but would eventually return in 2023 with their 11th and latest album, Dying of Everything. One of the first things I noticed when this album was announced was the cover art, which I honestly don't think fits the band really well. It seems like it'd be more fitting for like a black metal album. It is a really great painting, and it was done by Mariusz Lewandowski, rest in peace. But again, it just doesn't really feel like an Obituary artwork to me. That being said, what really counts is the music itself, and here I'm happy to say the music itself is awesome. I think Dying of Everything honestly has some of the band's best songwriting. It's like they took what they were doing on prior albums and asked, how can we make this even better? Barely Alive is a fast-pounding opener, which has pretty much become one of the band's trademarks at this point. But compared to those other fast-pounding openers from previous albums, this one has this neat little riff that crops up in the second half that really makes it feel special. Without a Conscience is another standout song that kind of sounds like some of the slower and dirtier songs from the prior albums, but just feels more well written in those tracks. I love the super heavy chugs that crop up in this track, for instance. I also have to mention the track The Wrong Time, which is just so catchy. I love that main riff in this track, and it also does some pretty cool stuff too, like soloing over one of the iterations of the chorus. One of the other things I like about Dying of Everything is how they took some of the stuff they were doing in the distant past and started reincorporating it here. The title track, for instance, kind of calls back to Cause of Death with an extended instrumental passage in its second half. Then you have the song My Will to Live, which has great riffs and really sparse use of vocals, which again reminds me a lot of Cause of Death. Overall, it just really sounds like they took their time to polish this album. You have some interesting vocal effects, for example, on the title track. The song War has some combat samples, which are pretty neat. Throughout this record, you just have great lead work as well. In fact, I would say some of the best guitar solos of the band's career. As always, John sounds great. There's some nice faster moments here, but I think the biggest issue with this album to me is just the closing track, Be Warned, which is kind of just a dull, doomy slog that feels like a bit of an anticlimactic finish. I actually wish they would have swapped Be Warned with the second to last track, Torn Apart, which just has this really fast and super catchy groove that I love and I think would have made a great ending to this record. My one other quibble is the sound here just feels a little mushier than the last album. I really like the way the self-titled album sounds, and with this one, I just don't enjoy it quite as much. Overall, though, I would say Dying of Everything does a great job at being accessible while calling back to the band's earlier material in a way that they've never really done before. It sounds like they really took their time and polished these songs and this album, and I think that really paid off. To me, Dying of Everything is probably their best album since Cause of Death. It's not perfect, certainly, but it's definitely one of the best Obituary albums. I will put it in the A tier. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think of Obituary. Let me know how you would rank their albums. And as always, if you like this video, please drop me a like, please subscribe. And if you want to see me talk about more metal, check out this video over here where I rank the albums of the Peruvian death metal band Mortem. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Thanks as always for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Stay heavy.